The war had been raging for 17 years when the Verity Confederacy finally broke through the last defensive line protecting the Kellian home system. Ambassador Thelis watched from the observation deck of the evacuation vessel as plasma fire tore through what remained of her people's orbital defense platforms, each explosion representing not just destroyed metal and technology but the deaths of hundreds of soldiers who had held their positions until the very end. The Kellians had been a peaceful species, traders and artists and philosophers who had built their civilization on the principles of negotiation and cultural exchange. They had believed, right up until the moment the Verity Armada appeared in their outer territories, that reason could solve any conflict. 17 years of war had taught them otherwise, but the lesson had come too late and at a cost measured in billions of lives. The Kellians were not the first civilization the Verity had targeted, nor would they be the last if the pattern held. The Verity Imperium had been expanding through this sector of the galaxy for 3 decades, moving from system to system with methodical brutality. They did not conquer for resources or territory in the traditional sense. They conquered because their ideology demanded it, because their interpretation of galactic order required the subjugation of what they termed lesser species. The Verity believed they had been chosen by cosmic destiny to impose structure on chaos, to bring order through domination. Every species that fell before them was given the same choice: submit to Verity authority and accept reduced status within their hierarchy, or face extermination. Most chose submission after witnessing what resistance cost. The Kellians had chosen to fight, and now they were paying the price for that choice. Thelis had been her people's ambassador to the Galactic Assembly, the loose confederation of independent species that maintained communication and trade networks across dozens of civilizations. She had spent the first 3 years of the war pleading for intervention, presenting evidence of Verity war crimes, documenting the destruction of civilian populations, making impassioned speeches about collective security and mutual defense. The Assembly had responded with strongly worded condemnations and economic sanctions that the Verity ignored completely. No member species was willing to commit military forces to the Kellian defense. They all had reasons, some more legitimate than others. The Thravaxians were too far away and their fleet was needed to protect their own borders. The Luxian Republic was bound by constitutional restrictions that prevented offensive military action. The Mirati Collective was negotiating a trade agreement with the Verity and did not want to jeopardize their economic interests. Each species had its justification, and collectively those justifications had allowed the Verity to conquer 3 civilizations and bring a 4th to the edge of extinction. The message had arrived 6 hours earlier, transmitted through military channels from a species Thelis had never heard of before. Humanity. She had to search the Assembly databases to find any information about them, discovering that humans were a relatively new member species who had joined the Assembly only 8 years prior. They were located in a remote spiral arm, far from the current conflict zone, and their entry into galactic politics had been noted primarily for their unusual insistence on maintaining complete military independence. Most species that joined the Assembly gradually integrated their defense forces into collective security arrangements. Humans had flatly refused, maintaining full sovereignty over their armed forces while participating enthusiastically in cultural and economic exchange. They had been pleasant enough neighbors, curious and energetic and perhaps a bit overwhelming in their eagerness to establish relationships, but hardly the sort of species one would expect to receive a military communication from. The message was brief and formal, addressed to the Kellian High Command and copied to Ambassador Thelis. It read, "The United Human Systems has received your petition for military assistance against Verity aggression. After careful review of the evidence you provided to the Galactic Assembly, and after exhausting all diplomatic channels to resolve this conflict peacefully, humanity has decided to invoke Article 17 of the Assembly Charter regarding intervention in cases of genocide and systematic war crimes. The Human Defense Fleet will arrive in your system within 6 hours. Hold your positions. Help is coming." The message was signed by someone called Fleet Admiral Chen, and it carried an attachment showing the authorization from something called the Unified Human Government, confirming that humanity had voted to enter the war. Thelis had not known whether to feel hope or despair when she read those words. Hope, Because any help was better than none, because perhaps this unknown species could buy them time to evacuate more civilians or establish a government in exile. Despair, because she had reviewed humanity's basic specifications in the assembly database and found nothing particularly impressive. They had achieved faster-than-light travel only 200 years ago. Their population was modest by galactic standards, concentrated in a single system with small colonies in a handful of others. Their technology level was rated as developing in most categories. They had no significant military victories on record because they had never fought in a major conflict beyond their own system. What could such a species possibly do against the Verity, who had been crushing civilizations for 3 decades? She had forwarded the message to High Command without much real expectation that it would change anything. The Kellyan military leadership was focused on evacuation protocols now, on saving as many civilians as possible before the final orbital defenses fell and Verity forces began landing on the homeworld. They acknowledged the human message with polite gratitude but continued their preparations for defeat. No one believed that a species no one had heard of, coming from the edge of known space, could alter the course of a war that 3 experienced military powers had already lost. No one imagined that everything was about to change. The human fleet arrived exactly 6 hours after the message was sent, emerging from faster-than-light travel at the outer edge of the Kellyan system in a formation that Thelis would later learn was called a combat drop. She was still on the observation deck of the evacuation vessel when the sensors registered their arrival, and she pulled up the tactical display with trembling hands, expecting to see a modest force of perhaps 50 or 100 ships. What she saw instead made her breath catch in her throat. The human fleet numbered over 800 vessels, arrayed in a formation that spoke of careful planning and aggressive intent. They were not coming to negotiate or observe. They were coming to fight, and they were bringing enough force to make that fight decisive. Within minutes of their arrival, the human fleet broadcast a message on all frequencies, in every major galactic language including Verity. The voice was calm, almost conversational, belonging to the same Fleet Admiral Chen who had signed the earlier message. She spoke with the easy confidence of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen and had already made peace with the consequences. This is Fleet Admiral Sarah Chen of the United Human Systems Defense Fleet, addressing all Verity forces currently engaged in hostile action against the Kellyan Confederacy. You are hereby ordered to cease all military operations and withdraw from Kellyan space immediately. This is your only warning. Failure to comply will result in the immediate engagement and destruction of your forces. You have 10 minutes to respond. The message ended, and then humanity waited, and Thelis realized with sudden clarity that the humans had not come to help the Kellyans win a war. They had come to end it. The Verity response came 8 minutes later, and it was exactly what everyone expected. Verity Commander Thrakus, who had led the assault on 3 civilizations and never once retreated or negotiated, transmitted a message dripping with contempt. His species communicated through a combination of vocalizations and pheromone signals that translated poorly into other languages, but the meaning was unmistakable. Humanity was an irrelevant newcomer interfering in affairs beyond their comprehension. The Verity Imperium recognized no authority but their own. The human fleet would be destroyed as a lesson to other species who might consider similar foolishness. Thrakus did not withdraw his forces. Instead, he repositioned them, turning a portion of his armada away from the Kellyan defenses to face this new threat. He had 400 warships under his command, veterans of multiple campaigns, equipped with weapon systems refined through decades of conquest. He looked at the human formation on his tactical displays and saw targets, not threats. Fleet Admiral Chen's response was not another warning or an attempt at further diplomacy. It was a simple tactical order transmitted on human military frequencies that the Kellyans were monitoring out of desperate hope and morbid curiosity. All ships, weapons free. Execute Plan Alpha 7. Let's show them why you don't threaten Earth's friends. What happened next would be analyzed by military strategists across the galaxy for generations, studied in war colleges and debated in academic circles, but in the moment, all Thelis could do was watch in stunned disbelief as the human fleet transformed from a defensive formation into something that resembled a pack of predators closing in on prey. The humans did not advance in the orderly lines that characterized most galactic naval tactics. They did not establish firing solutions from long range or attempt to maintain formation integrity. Instead, they accelerated directly toward the Verity fleet at velocities that seemed reckless, their ships moving with a coordination that spoke of countless hours of training in exactly this type of engagement. The Verity opened fire first, their particle beams and plasma cannons reaching out across the distance with the kind of firepower that had shattered Kellian battle groups in minutes. The human ships scattered before the barrage like a school of fish evading a predator, their movements synchronized but unpredictable, and then they returned fire with weapons systems that the Kellians had never seen before. Humanity had not shared the full extent of their military technology with the Galactic Assembly, and now the Kellians understood why. The weapons that tore into Verity hulls were not standard plasma cannons or particle beams. They were something called kinetic kill vehicles, projectiles accelerated to relativistic velocities that struck with the force of small nuclear weapons. They were missiles that maneuvered with impossible precision, adapting their trajectories in real time to compensate for defensive fire. They were directed energy weapons that seemed to bypass shields entirely, cooking the interiors of ships while leaving their hulls superficially intact. And they were deployed with a volume and accuracy that spoke of weapons systems designed specifically for one purpose: overwhelming enemy defenses through sheer concentrated violence. The first Verity ships began dying within 90 seconds of initial contact, their hulls rupturing under impacts they had no defensive doctrine for handling. Thrakus immediately adjusted his tactics, pulling his fleet into a tighter formation to concentrate defensive fire and provide mutual support. It was the correct tactical response to the situation he thought he faced, and it played directly into the trap humanity had set. The moment the Verity tightened their formation, the human fleet deployed weapons they had held in reserve, devices that Thelis would later learn were called cluster munitions. Single missiles that separated into hundreds of smaller warheads, each independently guided, each carrying enough explosive force to cripple a capital ship. The Verity point defense systems, designed to intercept dozens of incoming threats, found themselves facing thousands, and the mathematics of defensive fire became impossible. The battle, if it could even be called that, lasted 17 minutes from first contact to the moment Commander Thrakus transmitted his surrender. 17 minutes in which the human fleet dismantled a Verity armada. 147 Verity warships were completely destroyed, reduced to expanding clouds of debris and radiation. Another 208 were crippled, their propulsion disabled and their weapons offline, drifting helplessly while human ships maintained targeting locks on their hulls. The remainder of the Verity force attempted to retreat, but the human fleet had positioned faster interceptor craft along their escape vectors, and those ships that tried to flee found themselves cut off and forced to surrender or be destroyed. The human fleet suffered losses as well. 32 ships were destroyed, their crews lost in the violence of space combat. Another 73 were damaged to varying degrees. But those casualties, while tragic for the humans who mourned their dead, represented a loss ratio that defied every expectation of naval warfare. 32 ships lost in exchange for destroying or capturing an entire enemy fleet was not just victory. It was a statement, a demonstration that sent shock waves through every military command structure in the galaxy. The Verity had seemed invincible because no one had been willing to fight them with total commitment. Humanity had arrived, assessed the situation, and proceeded to dismantle that invincibility with methodical brutality. Thelis watched the tactical display as human boarding parties secured the surrendered Verity vessels, as medical ships moved to provide aid to both human wounded and captured Verity crews, as the fleet reorganized itself with the same precision it had shown in combat. She listened as Admiral Chen transmitted a message to the Kellian High Command, her voice still calm despite having just directed a battle that had killed thousands. Kellian Defense Forces, this is Admiral Chen. The immediate threat to your system has been neutralized. We're forwarding you tactical data on remaining Verity positions. Our fleet will remain in system for 72 hours to ensure no additional hostile forces arrive. After that, we'll need to push forward to liberate the systems the Verity currently occupy. We'd welcome any assistance your forces can provide, but we understand if you need time to recover. You've been fighting alone for a long time. You're not alone anymore. The Kellyan High Command response was delayed for several minutes, and when it came, Thelis could hear the emotion barely contained beneath military formality. They were warriors who had faced impossible odds for 17 years, who had watched their civilization burn, who had sent thousands to die in battles they knew could not be won, and who had finally received the help they had begged for. Admiral Chen, this is Fleet Commander Voreth. On behalf of the Kellyan Confederacy, we thank you for your intervention. We stand ready to support your operations in any capacity our forces can manage. But we must ask, how did you achieve this? Your species is new to the assembly. Your forces were unknown. How did you develop the capability to defeat an enemy that has conquered 3 civilizations? Admiral Chen's response would become famous, repeated in 100 languages across the galaxy, analyzed for its implications about human nature and human capabilities. Commander Voreth, humanity has been preparing for this kind of fight since we first reached the stars. We looked at the galaxy and we saw both wonder and danger. We saw civilizations that had achieved peace and prosperity, and we saw civilizations that would threaten that peace if left unchallenged. We decided that we would never be victims, and we would never allow our friends to be victims if we had the power to prevent it. So we built our fleets, we trained our personnel, and we developed our weapons systems with one specific purpose, to be ready for the day when someone like the Verity decided that might made right. Today was that day. And we want to be very clear about something. This war is over. Not this battle. The war. We're going to every system the Verity occupy, and we're going to give them the same choice we gave Commander Thrakus. Surrender or be destroyed. They thought they were an unstoppable force. They're about to learn they just ran into an immovable object that happens to have a lot of very advanced weapons. Earth protects its friends, Commander. That's not a policy. That's a promise. The human fleet moved to the next occupied system 4 days later, and Ambassador Thelis accompanied them aboard Admiral Chen's flagship, the UHSS Indomitable. She had requested permission to observe the liberation operations, partly in her capacity as Kellyan diplomatic representative but mostly because she needed to understand what humanity truly was. The species that had entered the Galactic Assembly 8 years ago with friendly greetings and cultural exchange programs did not align with the military force that had just obliterated a Verity armada in 17 minutes. She needed to reconcile these two versions of humanity, to understand how the same species could be both enthusiastic traders of art and music and also the most terrifyingly effective military force the galaxy had witnessed in recorded history. Admiral Chen granted her request with the easy hospitality that seemed characteristic of humans, assigning a young officer named Lieutenant Marcus Webb to serve as her liaison and guide. Webb was in his mid-20s by human reckoning, which Thelis had learned was barely into adulthood for their species, and he approached his duties with an earnestness that she found simultaneously endearing and confusing. He showed her the Indomitable's recreation facilities, where off-duty crew members played games and socialized. He introduced her to the ship's multi-faith chapel, explaining that humans held diverse religious beliefs and made space for all of them. He took her to the medical bay where wounded crew from the previous battle were recovering, and she watched as doctors and nurses provided care with genuine compassion while discussing their patients' prognosis with clinical precision. "You seem surprised by all this," Webb observed as they walked through one of the ship's main corridors. Around them, crew members moved with purposeful efficiency, saluting as the lieutenant passed but otherwise focused on their duties. "I've seen the way you watch us. Like you're trying to solve a puzzle." Thelis considered her response carefully, aware that she was speaking to a representative of a species she was still learning to understand. "Your people confuse me, Lieutenant. 4 days ago, I watched your fleet destroy an enemy force with an efficiency that I would describe as ruthless. Now I watch your crew members laugh together, practice their religions, care for their wounded with obvious affection. These seem like contradictory behaviors. Webb smiled, and it was a warm expression that reminded Thelis that humans were, despite everything, genuinely kind in their personal interactions. They're not contradictory at all, Ambassador. They're connected. We fight fiercely because we have so much worth protecting. Every person on this ship has family back home, has friends, has a life they care about. We've built a civilization we're proud of, full of art and music and philosophy and all the things that make life worth living. And we're absolutely willing to unleash hell on anyone who threatens that. The capacity for violence and the appreciation for beauty aren't opposites in human psychology. They're two sides of the same protective instinct. Their conversation was interrupted by a ship-wide announcement. The Indomitable and the rest of the human fleet were approaching the Morellian system, which had been under Verity occupation for 12 years. The Morellians had been traders and explorers, curious and adventurous people who had made first contact with the Kellians and introduced them to the Galactic Assembly. They had fought desperately when the Verity invaded, but their military had been designed for defense and exploration, not prolonged warfare. After 3 years of resistance, the Morellian government had surrendered to prevent total extinction. Since then, they had existed as a subject population, their autonomy stripped away, their culture suppressed, their people serving the Verity industrial machine. Thelis accompanied Lieutenant Webb to the observation deck as the fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel. The Morellian system spread before them, and she could see the evidence of Verity occupation even from this distance. Orbital industrial platforms surrounded the primary world, facilities designed to extract resources for the Verity war machine. Military stations bristled with weapons, positioned to defend against any liberation attempt. And at the heart of it all, a Verity occupation fleet of perhaps 200 ships maintained order through the implicit threat of overwhelming force. Admiral Chen's message to the Verity commander was identical to the one she had delivered in the Kellian system, calm and matter-of-fact in its ultimatum. Withdraw immediately or face destruction. This time, however, the Verity response was different. Commander Salvix, who controlled the occupation fleet, had clearly received reports about what happened to Commander Thrakus. His message was still defiant, still insisting on Verity supremacy, but it carried an undercurrent of uncertainty that had been absent before. He positioned his ships defensively around the industrial platforms, using the structures and the Morellian civilians working on them as shields, betting that humanity would not risk collateral damage to liberated populations. It was a reasonable tactical calculation based on how most galactic civilizations conducted warfare. The rules of engagement observed by assembly members prioritized civilian protection, often to the point of accepting military disadvantage rather than risking innocent lives. Commander Salvix was gambling that humans, as relatively new members of the assembly, would follow these same conventions. He was about to learn that humanity had different priorities, and that their concern for civilian life manifested in ways he had not anticipated. The human fleet did not attack immediately. Instead, they deployed what Admiral Chen called humanitarian assault shuttles, small fast craft that screened through the Verity defensive perimeter with speed and maneuverability that made them nearly impossible to intercept. These shuttles headed directly for the industrial platforms, and Thelis watched in amazement as they began docking with the facilities not to attack them but to evacuate the Morellian workers. Each shuttle could carry perhaps 50 passengers, and there were hundreds of shuttles, all of them moving with synchronized precision to extract civilians from the platforms before the battle began. Commander Salvix tried to stop them, directing point defense fire at the shuttles and ordering his ships to intercept them. The human fleet responded by deploying their fighter craft, small one-person vessels that moved with impossible agility and provided cover for the evacuation shuttles. Dogfights erupted across the orbital space as human pilots engaged Verity interceptors, and Thelis watched as the humans demonstrated the same overwhelming superiority in small craft combat that they had shown in capital ship engagement. The human fighters were faster, more maneuverable, and piloted by personnel who seemed to have been born in cockpits. They carved through Verity formations with casual efficiency, clearing paths for the evacuation shuttles while simultaneously destroying any Verity craft foolish enough to pursue them. The evacuation took 42 minutes, during which time the human fleet maintained complete tactical dominance of the orbital space without firing a single shot at the Verity capital ships. They simply controlled access to the industrial platforms, extracted every Morellian civilian, and transported them to designated safe zones away from the combat area. Only when the last shuttle confirmed all civilians were secured did Admiral Chen give the order to engage the occupation fleet. And then, with Morellian lives no longer at risk, humanity demonstrated exactly what happened when they were not constrained by concerns about collateral damage. The second battle was even shorter than the first. 14 minutes from initial engagement to complete Verity's surrender. The occupation fleet, already demoralized by reports from the Kellian system and now witnessing human capabilities firsthand, broke quickly. Commander Salvix himself survived and was brought aboard the Indomitable as a prisoner, where Thelis watched him being escorted to detention by Marine guards who treated him with professional courtesy despite having just killed hundreds of his personnel. She found herself in the same corridor as the Verity commander, and she saw in his compound eyes something she had never seen in a Verity before. Fear, certainly, but more than that. Comprehension. The understanding that his civilization had made a catastrophic miscalculation about how the galaxy worked and who held power within it. That evening, Thelis attended a briefing in Admiral Chen's ready room, where the Admiral outlined the plan for the remaining liberation operations. There were 5 more occupied systems, each requiring similar tactical approaches. The Admiral estimated the entire campaign would take between 6 and 8 days to complete, depending on how quickly Verity commanders decided to surrender once they realized resistance was futile. 6 to 8 days to end a war that had raged for 3 decades and consumed billions of lives. The disproportion was staggering, and Thelis finally asked the question that had been building since she first saw the human fleet arrive. Admiral, I need to understand something. Your species has only been in space for 200 years. You've never fought a major war against another civilization. How did you become so proficient at military operations? How did you develop these weapons, these tactics, this overwhelming capability? She paused, searching for the right words. It's as if you've been preparing for this specific scenario for your entire history as a spacefaring civilization. Admiral Chen leaned back in her chair, and her expression carried a weight that made her look older than her years. Ambassador, that's because we have been. When humanity reached the stars and realized we were not alone, we had to make a decision about what kind of civilization we wanted to be. We had just emerged from centuries of warfare on our own world, conflicts that had nearly destroyed us multiple times. We knew what war cost. We knew what violence meant. And we made a choice. She stood and walked to the viewport, looking out at the stars beyond. We decided we would never be the aggressors. We would never be the ones who started wars or conquered others. But we also decided we would never be victims. Never be the civilization that watched our friends suffer because we lacked the power to help them. So we built our military not to conquer but to protect, not to dominate but to ensure that domination was impossible. Every ship you see, every weapon system, every tactical doctrine, was developed with one question in mind: what would it take to defend Earth and our allies against any conceivable threat? And then we built enough to be certain we could meet that standard. The liberation of the remaining occupied systems proceeded with the same mechanical efficiency that had characterized the first 2 operations. The human fleet would arrive, evacuate any civilians in potential combat zones, issue their ultimatum, and then systematically dismantle any Verity forces that chose resistance over surrender. By the 8th day of operations, 4 of the 5 remaining systems had been secured, and the Verity occupation forces had collapsed into complete disorder. Ships were surrendering before the human fleet even finished transmitting their warnings. Commanders were abandoning their positions and fleeing toward Verity core territory. The Imperium that had seemed invincible for 3 decades had been broken in just over a week, and the galaxy was struggling to process the implications. Ambassador Thelis had spent those 8 days documenting everything she witnessed, sending daily reports to the Kellian government and to the Galactic Assembly. Her messages were clinical in their detail but could not entirely mask her sense of awe at what humanity had achieved. She described tactics that military experts would study for generations, weapon systems that represented paradigm shifts in combat technology, and a level of operational coordination that suggested humans had been training for exactly this scenario for their entire existence as a spacefaring species. But more than the technical aspects, she tried to convey the character of the people she was traveling with, these humans who could be simultaneously gentle in their personal interactions and absolutely ruthless in combat, who valued art and philosophy while maintaining the most powerful military force in known space. The final occupied system was Thravan Prime, and it held special significance for the Verity Imperium. It had been their first major conquest outside their home territory, the proof of concept that their ideology of domination could be successfully implemented. The Thravonians had been scholars and historians, their civilization built around vast libraries and educational institutions that preserved knowledge from hundreds of cultures. The Verity had destroyed most of those institutions in the initial invasion, burning libraries and executing intellectuals in a systematic attempt to break Thravonian cultural identity. The survivors had been reduced to manual labor, forbidden from practicing their own customs or teaching their children their own history. For 18 years, Thravan Prime had existed as a monument to Verity ideology, a demonstration of what happened to civilizations that refused to submit. The human fleet approached Thravan Prime with grim determination, and Admiral Chen addressed her crews before the final battle with words that Thelis found particularly revealing about human psychology. "This is the last one," the Admiral said, her voice broadcast throughout the fleet. "One more system to liberate, one more population to free, one more group of people who've suffered for far too long under occupation. I know you're tired. I know we've been in combat operations for over a week straight. I know some of you are grieving friends we've lost along the way. But I also know that when you signed up to serve in the defense fleet, you did it because you believed humanity had an obligation to stand against tyranny wherever we found it. Today we fulfill that obligation. The Verity have held Thravan Prime longer than any other conquest. They believe it proves their ideology is sustainable. We're going to prove them wrong. We're going to show them and every other potential aggressor in this galaxy that humanity will not tolerate the subjugation of peaceful civilizations. Not now. Not ever. Let's bring these people home." The Verity forces defending Thravan Prime were the largest concentration of military power humanity had yet faced, over 300 warships under the command of High Commander Vectrus, one of the Imperium's most experienced leaders. Vectrus had been present during the initial conquest of Thravan Prime and had supervised the occupation for nearly 2 decades. He knew what defeat would mean, not just militarily but ideologically. If humanity liberated Thravan Prime, if they dismantled the Verity's oldest and most symbolically important conquest, it would shatter the entire foundation of the Imperium's claim to cosmic destiny. Vectrus had no intention of surrendering, and he had positioned his forces to ensure that any battle would be as costly as possible for the human fleet. But Vectrus, for all his experience and tactical knowledge, had made the same error that every Verity commander had made. He assumed that human tactics would follow galactic conventions, that they would approach the battle with predictable caution and conventional formations. Instead, Admiral Chen deployed a strategy that Thelis would later learn was called shock and awe, a doctrine designed not merely to defeat an enemy but to break their will to resist. The human fleet divided into multiple task forces, each one attacking a different section of the Verity defensive perimeter simultaneously, overwhelming Verity command and control capabilities and forcing Vectrus to fight multiple battles at once. The engagement that followed was the longest and bloodiest of the campaign, lasting nearly 40 minutes and costing humanity 58 ships with another 126 damaged. Verity losses were catastrophic, 214 ships destroyed, 73 captured, and the remainder fleeing in disarray. High Commander Vectrus died when his flagship was hit by a human kinetic strike that shattered the vessel's main reactor, taking him and 3,000 Verity crew members with him. It was a grim reminder that for all humanity's technological superiority, war still extracted its price in lives and suffering. But the battle's outcome was never in doubt. Within an hour of the fighting ending, human ships were landing on Thravan Prime, and liberation forces were moving through the major population centers, dismantling Verity administrative structures and freeing Thravonian civilians from labor camps. Thelis accompanied one of these liberation teams, walking through the ruins of what had once been Thravan's Grand Central Library alongside Lieutenant Webb and a squad of human marines. The Thravonians who emerged from hiding or were released from detention camps stared at their liberators with expressions of disbelief, as if they could not quite process that their 18-year nightmare had finally ended. One elderly Thravonian, a female who introduced herself as Scholar Meltaz, approached Lieutenant Webb with tears streaming down her facial features that reminded Thelis of tree bark. "You're human?" she asked in heavily accented but comprehensible Standard Galactic. "We heard stories. We heard that a new species had joined the war. But we did not dare believe. We thought we would die under Verity rule. My children, my grandchildren, they know nothing but occupation. And now you tell me it is over. That the Verity are gone." Webb helped the elderly scholar sit on a piece of rubble that had once been part of a library wall, his expression carrying the compassion Thelis had come to recognize as characteristically human. "It's over, scholar. The Verity occupation forces have been defeated. My species has a saying, freedom is not free. It means that liberty has to be defended, that it requires sacrifice to maintain. Your people paid that price for 18 years. You survived. You preserved your identity even when they tried to erase it. That took incredible courage." He paused, and Thelis saw him blink back his own tears, moved by this stranger's suffering in a way that spoke to humanity's capacity for empathy. "We're here now. We're going to help you rebuild. Not just your buildings and your libraries, but your civilization. And we're going to make sure nothing like this ever happens to you again. That's a promise." Over the following hours, Thelis watched as human engineering teams began emergency repairs to critical infrastructure, as medical personnel treated Thravonians who had been denied adequate healthcare under occupation, as logistics specialists organized food distribution to populations on the edge of starvation. The humans moved with practiced efficiency, but there was nothing cold or mechanical about their approach. They learned Thravonian names, asked about families, took time to listen to stories about what had been lost and what had survived. They were not just liberators in the military sense. They were, Thelis realized, genuinely invested in the well-being of people they had never met before arriving in this system. That evening, as reconstruction efforts continued under portable lighting, Admiral Chen held a joint press conference with the newly re-established Thravonian Provisional Government. Representatives from dozens of civilizations attended remotely, including the Galactic Assembly leadership and delegations from the Verity Imperium itself, which had spent the past week in complete political chaos as their military collapse triggered internal power struggles. Chen stood before the assembled media with the same calm demeanor she had maintained throughout the campaign, and she delivered a statement that would reshape galactic politics for generations to come. 8 days ago, the United Human Systems entered this war because we believed the Verity Imperium's actions constituted crimes against sentient species that demanded intervention. Today, that war is over. Every occupied system has been liberated. Every Verity occupation force has been defeated or surrendered. The populations that suffered under Imperium rule are free. She paused, letting that sink in for the beings watching across dozens of star systems. But this is not the end of humanity's involvement in this region. We are committed to supporting the reconstruction of the civilizations that were damaged by Verity aggression. We are opening trade relationships, providing humanitarian aid, and offering defensive treaties to any species concerned about future security threats. More importantly, we are proposing a fundamental reform of how the Galactic Assembly handles aggression between member species. The proposal Admiral Chen presented to the Galactic Assembly 3 weeks after the war's end became known as the Collective Defense Initiative, and it represented the most significant shift in galactic governance since the Assembly's founding. The core principle was elegant in its simplicity: member species would commit to mutual defense agreements, pledging to respond with military force to any act of aggression against assembly members. Species that chose not to participate would remain assembly members with full trading and diplomatic privileges, but they would not receive the protection of the collective security guarantee. And humanity made it clear they would serve as the initiative's primary military force, at least until other species developed comparable capabilities. The assembly debates were fierce and prolonged, exposing fault lines in galactic civilization that had been papered over for generations. Some species embraced the initiative enthusiastically, recognizing that humanity had proven capable of providing security that the assembly's previous structure could not. Others objected to what they saw as the militarization of interspecies relations, arguing that humanity's overwhelming power would inevitably corrupt the democratic nature of assembly governance. The Verity Imperium, now under new leadership after a revolution that had toppled the old hierarchy, sent representatives to argue that the initiative represented collective punishment for their civilization's actions and would prevent their rehabilitation into the galactic community. Ambassador Thelis found herself at the center of these debates, her testimony about what she had witnessed during the liberation campaign becoming crucial evidence in the discussion. She spoke before the full assembly, her words broadcast to billions of beings across dozens of civilizations, and she chose her words carefully, aware that she was helping to shape the future of galactic civilization. "I watched humanity fight this war," she said, standing at a podium that had once seemed impossibly distant when she was begging for intervention. "I saw their capabilities, which are formidable and rightfully inspire both respect and concern. But more importantly, I saw their character. They did not enter this war for territorial gain or resource extraction. They gained nothing material from their intervention except the deaths of hundreds of their personnel and the cost of military operations that will take their economy years to absorb." She paused, looking out at the assembled delegates representing the diversity of galactic civilization, seeing in their varied forms and features the complexity of the question they were trying to answer. They fought because they believed that peaceful civilizations deserved protection from aggressive ones. Because they thought it was wrong to watch genocide unfold while having the power to stop it. Because their values demanded that they act even when the cost was high and the benefit to themselves was non-existent. I understand the concerns about giving any species this much military authority. But I also remember 17 years of watching my people die while the assembly passed resolutions and imposed sanctions that changed nothing. Humanity ended in 8 days a war that killed billions and destroyed civilizations. They did what we could not do for ourselves. If that is what military power looks like when wielded by a species that values life and liberty, then perhaps we need more of it, not less. The vote took place over the course of 3 days, with each member species given time to consult their own governments and populations. The final tally was closer than humanity had hoped but still represented a clear mandate. 32 species voted to join the Collective Defense Initiative, 11 voted against, and 4 abstained. The Kellyan Confederacy was among the first to sign the Mutual Defense Treaty, followed quickly by the Threvonians and Morellians. The Luxian Republic, after intense internal debate, voted to join while simultaneously beginning a massive expansion of their own military capabilities, not wanting to remain dependent on human protection indefinitely. Even some species that had been sympathetic to the Verity Imperium joined, motivated more by fear of being left outside the security umbrella than by enthusiasm for the initiative's principles. The Verity themselves were offered a path to eventual membership, but with conditions that would take decades to fulfill. Complete demilitarization of their offensive forces, reparations to occupied populations, trials for war criminals, and fundamental reforms to their government structure that would prevent future aggressive expansionism. The new Verity leadership accepted these terms, having little choice given their military collapse and facing the reality that attempting to rebuild their war machine would trigger immediate intervention. Humanity stationed monitoring vessels in Verity space, not as occupiers but as peacekeepers, ensuring compliance with the demilitarization agreements while allowing Verity civilization to reconstruct itself along less destructive lines. For the Kellyan Confederacy, the transition from devastated war survivor to secure member of a collective defense network was disorienting in its speed. Ambassador Thelis returned to her homeworld to find reconstruction efforts already underway with human assistance. Engineering teams were helping rebuild orbital platforms. Agricultural specialists were addressing food security issues caused by years of blockade. Educators were sharing human knowledge about trauma counseling, helping Kellyan society process the psychological damage of 17 years of total war. And everywhere, there were young humans, volunteers who had come to help with reconstruction, learning Kellyan language and customs while sharing their own culture in return. Thelis found herself spending time with these volunteers, trying to understand the species that had so dramatically altered her civilization's fate. She spoke with a young woman named Maria Santos who was teaching in a reconstructed school, helping Kellyan children return to education after years of disruption. "Why are you here?" Thelis asked her one afternoon as they watched students play in a courtyard that had been rubbled 3 months earlier. "Your military freed my people. You've already done more than anyone had any right to expect. Why send volunteers to help with reconstruction?" Maria considered the question with the thoughtfulness Thelis had come to associate with humans discussing serious topics. Because winning the war was only the first step. The real work is helping your civilization recover and rebuild. And because humans believe that we're all connected, that what happens to you matters to us even though we come from different worlds. We have a concept called Ubuntu, from one of our African languages. It means, I am because we are. The idea that our humanity, our personhood, is tied up with the well-being of others. Your suffering diminishes us. Your recovery enriches us. So we're here not just because it's the right thing to do, but because helping you rebuild is part of building the kind of galaxy we want to live in. Months became years, and the Collective Defense Initiative evolved from an emergency response to established galactic infrastructure. Humanity trained joint military forces with their initiative partners, sharing technology and tactical knowledge while learning from the different approaches other species brought to defense. The initiative's first major test came when a pirate coalition attempted to establish a base in disputed territory, betting that the new defensive alliance would prove ineffective in practice. The combined initiative fleet, led by humans but including ships from 7 member species, responded within 12 hours and dismantled the pirate operation with minimal casualties. The message was clear: the galaxy had a new security paradigm, and testing it was inadvisable. 5 years after the end of the war, Admiral Chen retired from active military service and accepted a position as the first director of Initiative Operations, coordinating defense policy across member species. Ambassador Thelis, now serving as the Kellyan Confederacy's representative to the Initiative Council, found herself working alongside the Admiral in a capacity neither could have imagined during those desperate days when the Verity were at the gates. They had become friends across the years, two beings from different worlds who had witnessed history together and now worked to ensure the lessons learned would not be forgotten. On the anniversary of the war's end, Thelis attended a memorial ceremony aboard the Indomitable, now serving as the initiative's flagship. The ceremony honored all those who had died in the conflict. Kellyan, Travonian, Morellian, and all the other species that had suffered under Verity occupation, as well as the human personnel who had given their lives in the liberation. Admiral Chen, or Director Chen as she now was, spoke to the assembled gathering with the same quiet authority Thelis remembered from their first meeting. "We gather today to remember those we lost, to honor their sacrifice, and to recommit ourselves to the principles they died defending. Freedom. Justice. The fundamental right of all sentient species to determine their own destiny without fear of domination. 5 years ago, humanity entered a war that was not originally ours, and we did so because we believed these principles were worth fighting for. Today, we stand in a galaxy that is safer, more just, and more united than it was then. That is the legacy our fallen helped create, and it is our responsibility to preserve it." Thelis watched as the names of the dead scrolled across displays throughout the ship, thousands of individuals from dozens of species, each one a person with hopes and dreams and people who mourned them. She thought about how much had changed, how a species no one had paid much attention to had reshaped galactic civilization in a matter of days. She thought about the war that had consumed 17 years of her life and ended in 8 days once humanity decided it was over. And she thought about the future her people now had, a future that was uncertain but full of possibility, secured by beings who had come from across the stars because they believed suffering demanded response and friendship demanded action. The memorial ended with a moment of silence, and in that silence, Thelis made a private vow. She would spend the rest of her life working to ensure that the sacrifice of all those who died would mean something lasting. That the initiative would grow stronger and more inclusive, that collective security would prevent future wars, that the galaxy would learn from this terrible period and choose better. It was ambitious, perhaps impossibly so, but she had learned from humanity that impossible just meant difficult, and difficult was no reason not to try. The war was over. The work of peace had only begun. And she was ready for it, standing alongside friends from Earth who had taught her that the measure of civilization was not its capacity for violence but its willingness to defend those who could not defend themselves. When humans joined the war, it was over in hours. But what they had started would last for generations.